John and Sarah had always seemed like the perfect couple. Their relationship on the surface was the epitome of suburban bliss. A comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, a beautiful young child, and a life that many would envy. They had been married for 7 years, and to the outside world, everything looked picture perfect. But like many relationships, things were not as they seemed. Beneath the surface, there were cracks that had been slowly forming, unseen by everyone, including John himself. John was a successful businessman, working long hours to provide for his family. His career demanded a lot of his attention, and while he was dedicated to his work, he never imagined how it might affect his marriage. Sarah, on the other hand, had always been the anchor at home. She was a stay-at-home mom, caring for their young daughter, Emily, and running the household. Sarah had once been the radiant woman John had fallen in love with, loving, attentive, and full of life. But over the last year or so, something had begun to change. It was subtle at first, a slight distance in her gaze, a few more late nights out with friends, an occasional hurried exit to run errands. John told himself that it was nothing. After all, Sarah had been his rock. But then, things began to get worse. When they spent time together, the conversation seemed strained. Sarah seemed distracted, often lost in thought or absorbed in her phone. John brushed it off at first, chalking it up to stress or exhaustion. The weight of his career had taken a toll on him as well, and he had been spending less and less time at home. Perhaps, he thought, Sarah was simply lonely. But then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday evening, and John had just returned home from an exhausting business trip. He entered the house, expecting the usual warmth of his family's embrace, but instead, there was a chilling emptiness. Sarah was in the kitchen, her back turned to him as she stirred something in a pot. Her phone, face down on the counter, buzzed repeatedly. John glanced at it casually, but something stopped him, an unsettling feeling in his gut. His gaze lingered on the phone, and the name that flashed on the screen was unfamiliar. It was a text from someone named Mike. John tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort that settled in his chest. It was probably nothing, he thought, but as the evening wore on, his unease grew. The more he tried to push it away, the more insistent it became. This wasn't the first time he had noticed Sarah's growing obsession with her phone. She had always been protective of it, but lately it felt like a wall between them, a wall that, despite his attempts, he couldn't seem to break down. That night, as John lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the thought gnawed at him. Was something more going on here? Little did he know, this was the beginning of a journey that would uncover truths he never expected. A journey that would tear apart everything he thought he knew about his marriage and shatter the image of the woman he once trusted completely. The stage was set for betrayal, and soon John would learn just how far Sarah was willing to go to test their love. The first hint that something was amiss came almost imperceptibly, like a distant hum in the background of a busy day. John had always prided himself on being a good husband, devoted, loving, and hardworking. His career had often pulled him away from home, but he had always made an effort to stay connected with Sarah and their daughter, Emily. However, lately, the small things that once brought him peace were becoming more unsettling than reassuring. It began with Sarah's strange behavior, subtle but undeniable. It started with the phone. The phone that had once been an ordinary, everyday object now seemed like a mysterious, sacred relic. Sarah had always been protective of her devices, but it was different now. John began to notice how she would always keep her phone with her, even when she was in the kitchen or the bathroom. She never left it on the counter anymore, and when she did set it down, she would always face it down. It was a small thing, but to John, it felt like a subtle shift, a shift that made him uncomfortable. At first, he thought he was overthinking things. After all, Sarah had always been a private person when it came to her phone, but something about her recent behavior fell off. There were more late nights, more girls' nights out, that seemed to extend into early mornings. When John asked her about these nights, she would offer quick explanations that didn't add up. Just needed to clear my head, she would say, or I haven't had time for myself in so long. At first, he accepted these answers. Sarah had always been the one to take care of everyone else, and perhaps she just needed a break. But deep down, a small voice kept whispering that something was wrong. It was a Thursday evening when the real unease began. John had come home late from a dinner meeting, expecting Sarah to be waiting for him, as she usually did, with a warm dinner and a smile. But instead, she was sitting in the living room, her head buried in her phone. Emily was already in bed, and the house was eerily quiet. Sarah looked up for a moment, smiled absent-mindedly, and said, "Hey, how was your day?" But her tone was flat, distracted. John nodded, responding with the usual pleasantries. But as he made his way to the kitchen to grab a drink, he caught a glimpse of Sarah's phone screen. Her message notifications were lit up. There were dozens of them, all from the same contact, Mike. John froze for a moment, feeling a chill run down his spine. He wasn't a jealous person by nature, but there was something about the name that caught him off guard. Mike. Who was this Mike? He tried to shake the feeling of unease and dismiss the thought. It could be a friend, a colleague, someone completely harmless. But that night, as he lay awake in bed, his thoughts kept drifting back to the messages he had glimpsed. There had been something too familiar about their tone, the way Sarah had typed, the flirty emojis, the inside jokes. Something wasn't right. His gut was telling him that the bond they shared wasn't just friendly. The next morning, the curiosity became unbearable. John knew he couldn't continue living in the shadows of suspicion. He needed to know. So, as Sarah got ready for the day, he picked up her phone, careful not to draw attention. He wasn't proud of what he was about to do, but in that moment, he couldn't help it. His hands trembled as he unlocked the device and opened the messaging app. The messages were intimate, far more intimate than any conversation between married friends should be. There were texts about private moments, promises of future plans, and confessions that sent a wave of betrayal crashing over him. One message from Mike read, "I can't wait to see you this weekend, Sarah. You make everything feel right." Another, "Last night was amazing. You're everything I've wanted." John's stomach twisted into knots. He scrolled further through the messages, his mind racing with disbelief. This wasn't just a friendship. This was an affair, an emotional and perhaps physical connection that Sarah had been hiding from him for months. He felt sick to his core, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly cracked open. How had he not noticed? How had Sarah kept this secret for so long? The realization hit him hard, like a slap in the face. Sarah betrayed him, not just once, but over and over again. She had been lying, playing him for a fool. All the late nights, all the "I need space" excuses. They were all a cover-up for her affair with Mike. John's hands shook as he quickly locked the phone and placed it back where he found it. His mind was racing, torn between confronting her immediately or staying silent until he could process everything. His chest felt tight, his thoughts clouded by a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sorrow. He had always trusted Sarah. He had never once imagined that she could betray him like this. But now the truth was undeniable. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, had been lying to him for months. And the worst part was, she hadn't just betrayed his trust. She had destroyed the foundation of everything they had built together. In an instant, his world had shattered. Later that evening, as Sarah returned from her girls' night out, John found himself standing in the doorway, his face a mask of calm. Inside, though, he was seething, torn apart by the discovery he had just made. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. She looked at him, her eyes widening in surprise. She knew something was wrong. The truth was about to come crashing down on them both. The confrontation was inevitable, but John couldn't prepare himself for the overwhelming wave of emotion that came with it. The betrayal was fresh, raw, and like an open wound he couldn't ignore. Every moment since his discovery felt like a blur. His mind raced with thoughts of everything that had led up to this point, the years of trust and intimacy that now felt like lies. That evening, after Sarah returned from her outing with friends, John knew that the time had come to face the truth. He had no choice. The evidence was staring him in the face, and ignoring it any longer would be a betrayal of himself. His pulse pounded in his ears as he paced the living room, waiting for Sarah to walk in, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. When she stepped through the door, She smiled, her face lit with the same familiar warmth, though there was a certain distance in her eyes that John had grown used to seeing over the past few months. She set her purse down and kicked off her shoes, humming softly to herself. But the sight of her, the woman he had loved, the woman who had promised to stand by him no matter what, only intensified the knot in his chest. He could no longer ignore the betrayal. "John, you're quiet tonight. What's wrong?" Sarah asked, walking into the kitchen, seemingly oblivious to the tension thickening the air. John's throat felt dry as he swallowed. He had to say something. He had to confront her. He couldn't keep living with this gnawing suspicion. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke, his words shaky but firm. "I know, Sarah. I know about Mike." Sarah froze. The smile faltered on her lips, and she slowly turned to face him, her eyes betraying a flash of panic. For a split second, John saw the woman he had married, the woman who would have done anything to protect their family. But in that moment, something else was there too, guilt, fear, and a deep sense of shame. "John, she began, but her words faltered. She took a step back, as if trying to distance herself from the confrontation that was about to unfold. John didn't give her the chance to deflect. His voice grew stronger as the anger and sadness that had been building up for days finally broke free. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I saw the messages, the text between you and him." He took a deep breath, tried to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. "How long, Sarah? How long have you been seeing him? Was it just physical? Was it emotional? How long have I been living with this lie?" Sarah's face turned pale, and she stepped back once more, her eyes searching his face, as if she was looking for an escape, a way to deny everything. But there was no escaping now. The truth was in front of them both, plain and simple. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, John," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "It was never about you, okay? It wasn't that I didn't love you. I was lost. I felt alone." John's chest tightened at her words. His mind raced back to all the moments he had dismissed, all the subtle signs he had ignored. The late nights, the evasive answers, the distant gaze. He had been too absorbed in his own world, too focused on his work, to notice the cracks in their relationship. Sarah had been right there, but he had failed to see her slipping away. "I felt like I was fading into the background, John," Sarah continued, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You were so busy, and I was just here. I started feeling invisible. Mike made me feel seen, like I mattered again. It was stupid. It was wrong, and I regret it. I never meant for it to go this far." John's heart broke as he listened to her words. She was explaining it away, trying to justify her actions, but it was no use. None of it mattered now. The damage was done, and the truth was out. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a betrayal that cut deeper than he could have ever imagined. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you." John shook his head, the weight of her words sinking in. The rawness of his pain was almost unbearable. How could she say she didn't want to hurt him when her actions had already torn him apart? "Did you even care about us, Sarah?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Did you care about our family? Did you care about Emily? Or was I just another man who was enough?" "I do care, John. I do. I love you. I love Emily," Sarah insisted, tears spilling down her cheeks. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I felt invisible, and Mike was there when I needed someone. Don't you dare make this about your loneliness." John snapped, the rage rising within him. "You betrayed me, Sarah. You lied to me. You put everything we built at risk, all for someone who didn't matter, someone who doesn't matter." She looked down at the floor, ashamed, as if she couldn't bear to face him anymore. The silence between them was suffocating. There was nothing more to say, nothing more that could make this right. The affair wasn't a mistake. It was a choice that had shattered the foundation of their marriage. John took a step back, unable to look at her anymore. He wanted to scream, to cry, to somehow make sense of everything that had just come to light, but he couldn't. The woman he had trusted most in this world had betrayed him in the most intimate way. He couldn't reconcile that with the woman standing in front of him now, pleading for forgiveness. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah. I don't know if I could ever look at you the same way again," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've broken something between us that I don't think can ever be fixed." The words hit Sarah like a slap. Her body slumped, and for a moment, she seemed to lose all strength. "Please," she whispered, reaching out toward him, but he stepped back, away from her touch. "I need time. I need space," he said coldly, his voice final. He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing there, broken and alone, her sobs echoing through the empty house. The days following the confrontation were nothing short of a whirlwind, a chaotic storm of emotions that left John reeling, unable to make sense of anything. The house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a battlefield. Every corner of their home, every room, seemed to carry the weight of Sarah's betrayal, and it was suffocating. John found himself waking up every morning with a gnawing emptiness in his chest, an aching reminder that everything he believed in, everything he worked so hard to build, was shattered. The discovery of Sarah's affair had torn apart the foundation of their marriage, but also left him questioning everything about their life together. Were the good times real? Were the moments of love and connection nothing more than a facade? He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been living in a lie, and the pain was unbearable. He tried to focus on Emily. She was only 5 years old, innocent and unaware of the storm that had rocked their family. John couldn't help but wonder how much of the tension she had already sensed. Children were perceptive, and despite their best efforts to shield them from adult problems, Emily could feel the change in the air. She noticed that her mom was no longer around as much, that John was quieter, more distant. She would often ask, "Where's Mommy?" with a look of confusion in her big eyes, and John would have to swallow the lump in his throat before responding, "She's just busy, sweetheart." The lies had already begun to pile up, little ones that he had to tell to protect Emily from the raw truth, but they weighed heavily on him. He hated lying to her. It was one thing to protect his child from the reality of a messy divorce, but another to constantly fake normalcy when every fiber of his being was torn apart. In the evenings, after Emily went to bed, John would retreat into his own isolation. He could feel Sarah's presence in every room. She hovered in the kitchen, sometimes like a ghost, still tried to help with meals, but their interactions had grown awkward, distant. Her attempts to connect felt forced, insincere, like she was trying to mend something that couldn't be fixed. They would speak about trivial things, how their daughter's day had gone, what groceries needed to be bought. But the real issues, the heart of the matter, remained unspoken between them, hanging like a dark cloud. Sarah, for her part, was consumed by guilt. She had always been a loving mother, and now she found herself lost, unsure of how to move forward. She tried to do everything she could for Emily, making her favorite meals, reading her bedtime stories, but the cracks in her marriage were so deep, she couldn't help but feel like a failure. She had broken the most sacred promise, the one she had made to John, to their family. Every night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the man she had once loved, wondering how she had ended up here. And even though she had told herself she was remorseful, part of her knew that there was no turning back from what she had done. But it wasn't just the marriage that was suffering. It was their entire family dynamic. Sarah's affair had altered the very essence of their relationship. Once, they had been partners in every sense of the word, equal in their responsibilities, their hopes, and their dreams for the future. Now, John couldn't look at Sarah without seeing the betrayal in her eyes. It was as if everything had changed in an instant, and their shared history had been wiped clean. John tried, for the sake of Emily, to keep the peace. He wanted to be civil, at least, but every conversation with Sarah, every look they exchanged, was fraught with tension. There was an invisible wall between them now, one that he couldn't bring himself to tear down. He didn't trust her anymore, not just because of the affair, but because of everything she had hidden from him. The lies had built a barrier that even their daughter couldn't breach. The hardest part for John was seeing how the affair had affected Emily. Their little girl had begun acting out, refusing to go to bed without an extra cuddle, getting upset at the smallest things, asking questions about why Mommy and Daddy weren't laughing together like they used to. John didn't know how to answer. How could he explain the devastation that had torn their family apart in a way a child could understand? How could he protect Emily from a reality that her mother had broken the trust that had once held them all together? For Sarah, the guilt was a constant companion. She could see the changes in Emily, too. The once bubbly little girl was now quieter, more withdrawn. She missed the way their family had once felt, safe, happy, whole. Sarah knew she was to blame for this shift, for the cracks in Emily's world. But even as the guilt crushed her, she didn't know how to fix it. She didn't know if there was any way to make things right. Days passed, and the emotional toll on the family was becoming unbearable. John and Sarah barely spoke unless it was about logistics. Who would pick up Emily from school? Who would take her to her doctor's appointments? The intimacy they once shared was gone, replaced by silence and uncertainty. And every time John looked at Sarah, his heart ached. Not just for himself, but for the family they used to be. The emotional fallout from Sarah's affair was not just the end of their marriage. It was the unraveling of their entire family. And no one knew how to put the pieces back together. It had been weeks since the emotional fallout of Sarah's affair came to light. And while the raw pain hadn't entirely faded, a fragile truce had formed between John and Sarah. They were still living under the same roof, but the love that once bound them together now felt like a distant memory. Their conversations were limited to the necessary details of daily life. How to care for Emily, who would pick her up from school, and inevitable discussions about bills and chores. Everything else was avoided, swept under the rug. Sarah had promised John that she was done with Mike. She had cut all contact with him, erased every trace of their relationship from her phone, and even deleted social media profiles she had used to stay in touch with him. But John was not ready to believe it. Trust was something that had been shattered beyond repair, and though Sarah claimed to want to rebuild it, John couldn't shake the nagging doubt that lingered in the back of his mind. In an attempt to push past the emotional rubble, Sarah proposed something drastic. A trip, a fresh start of sorts. She had suggested that they take a weekend getaway. Just the two of them. No distractions. No Emily. No work. She thought that perhaps the distance, the new environment, might allow them to reconnect, to talk about everything that had gone wrong, and figure out if their marriage was worth saving. It was a bold move, one that John wasn't sure he was ready for. But he agreed, half out of obligation and half because he wanted to believe that they could work things out, that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to heal the rift. The trip was to a secluded cabin by a quiet lake, far from their busy lives, far from everything that reminded them of the pain. The moment they arrived, the silence of the place settled around them like a heavy fog. The air was fresh and crisp, the trees standing tall against the horizon. There were no neighbors, no distractions, just the two of them, forced to face each other without the barriers that the outside world provided. John was quiet as they unloaded the car. The weight of the trip hung over him like a cloud, heavy with expectations. Sarah was just as silent, though her nervous energy was palpable. She kept glancing at him, searching his face for any sign of hope, but he remained unreadable. He had agreed to come, but he wasn't sure he was ready to forgive, or even to try to rebuild what they had lost. The first evening was awkward. They sat down for dinner in the cozy dining room, the soft crackle of the fire filling the room with warmth. Sarah tried to initiate small talk, but it felt forced. They talked about the weather, about how beautiful the cabin was, about anything other than the elephant in the room. She kept asking, "How are you feeling?" But her voice trembled with a question, as if she already knew the answer. John's mind wandered as they ate. He kept glancing at Sarah, trying to see her the way he once had, trying to find that spark of love that had brought them together in the first place. But it wasn't there. Not yet. He was still angry, still hurt. He didn't know if he could ever trust her again, no matter how many promises she made. After dinner, they sat by the fire, the crackling flames casting shadows on the walls. Sarah moved closer to him, her hand resting on the arm of the couch, inches from his. She wasn't touching him, but the closeness seemed like a plea, an invitation. She needed him to understand. She needed him to forgive her. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the fire. "I've hurt you more than I can ever express. I know I've broken your trust, and I don't know how to fix it. But I'm here. I want to make things right. I want us to heal. John looked into the fire, his eyes distant. The flickering light reflected the turmoil inside him. He was so close to saying something, to finally opening up about the pain, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. But he hesitated. He couldn't bring himself to speak the words. How could he? Could he truly forgive her for what she had done? Could he forget the betrayal, the broken promises, the lies? He turned to her, his voice low but firm. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. What you did, it changed everything. And I don't know how to move past it. His voice faltered for a moment, and the vulnerability he had kept hidden spilled out, raw and unguarded. But I want to try. For Emily. For us. I just need time. And I need to know that everything you're saying, is real. That you're really committed to fixing this. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she nodded, her heart breaking with every word he spoke. I am, John. I swear I am. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose this. I want us to work. I'll do whatever it takes. For the first time in weeks, John felt a flicker of something in his chest. A spark of hope, though faint. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a reminder of what could be. The trip had not been the cure, and it hadn't erased the damage Sarah had caused, but it was a step forward, a test of their commitment to each other and to their family. That night, as they lay in the bed they used to share, the silence between them wasn't as heavy. There were no promises made, no guarantees given, but there was something, an unspoken understanding that this trip wasn't the end, but the beginning of a long, difficult road to healing. The journey ahead would require patience, vulnerability, and trust, but for the first time in a long time, John felt like maybe, just maybe, it was worth the effort. The weekend away was supposed to be a turning point for John and Sarah. It was supposed to be the moment they either repaired their marriage or walked away from it for good. But as they sat together in the quiet of the cabin, the evening fading into an uncomfortable silence, Sarah knew something had to change. The facade of her remorse, the desperate pleas for forgiveness, had only gone so far. She had made promises to John, to herself, and to their family. But underneath it all, there was still a nagging voice that urged her to consider the path she had already begun to tread long before the affair was exposed. In the days since her affair with Mike had come to light, Sarah had tried to convince herself that she could truly turn things around with John. She had told herself that she wanted to salvage their family, that she wanted to be a good wife, a good mother. But there was a deeper part of her, a part she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge, that felt trapped in a marriage that no longer fulfilled her, trapped in a life that felt constricting and suffocating. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Sarah's mind wandered back to Mike. He wasn't just a moment of weakness. He had been the person who made her feel seen, appreciated, and desired in a way John no longer did. She had told herself that she was done with him, that she could erase him from her life. But the truth was harder to face. Mike was still in the back of her mind, still a presence she couldn't completely shake off. And if she was truly honest with herself, she wasn't ready to let go of him. The betrayal hadn't been a single lapse in judgment. It had been the culmination of months of emotional distance, loneliness, and neglect. She had told herself that it was a mistake, that she was just searching for something that was missing. But as the days passed, the weight of her choices began to sink in. She had not only hurt John, she had also hurt herself. And now, sitting across from John, watching his face, full of hurt, full of anger, but also, faintly, full of hope, Sarah knew she had to make a choice. She could pretend to try, pretend to care about repairing their marriage, and follow the plan that she and John had agreed upon. Or she could face the truth, take the risk of breaking everything wide open, and choose the path that felt more honest. In the quiet of the cabin, Sarah's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to walk away from Mike. She had already decided, long before this trip, that she was going to leave John. She had to. She knew it now with an unsettling clarity. John didn't deserve this. He deserved someone who could be fully invested in him, not someone who had one foot out the door, constantly yearning for something else. And as much as it hurt her to admit it, she knew that someone was not her. She stood up from her seat slowly, her movements deliberate. John, sitting across from her, noticed a change in her posture. The conversation had stalled, the silence stretching on longer than either of them could bear, and now, Sarah was making her way toward the kitchen. She wasn't sure how to start this conversation, but the weight of the decision felt pressing, suffocating. When she returned, Sarah had a calmness about her that John didn't recognize. She sat back down across from him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity he hadn't seen in months. There was no more hesitation in her gaze, no more pleading for forgiveness. "John," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I need to be honest with you. I've been holding something back. Something I should have told you before we came on this trip." Her hands were clenched together, fingers interlaced as she stared at them, avoiding his eyes for a moment. John's heart skipped a beat, his stomach tightening in anticipation. He had known there was something else, something deeper that Sarah wasn't telling him. The truth always had a way of making itself known. "What is it, Sarah?" His voice was strained, his patience wearing thin. He had already been betrayed once. He wasn't sure how much more of this he could handle. "What is it that you've been hiding?" Sarah inhaled deeply and finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "I'm not sure I can do this anymore," she said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "I've tried, John. I've tried to make things work, but I can't. I'm not the person I was when we got married. I've changed, and as much as I want to believe that we could get past this, I know in my heart that I've already made my choice." John stared at her, his mind racing as the weight of her words crashed down on him. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing out loud was a different kind of pain. The betrayal wasn't just about Mike anymore. It was about Sarah, about her not being the woman he thought she was. He had been grasping at straws, trying to hold on to something that was slipping through his fingers. "Sarah," he said, his voice raw with disbelief, "are you telling me you're leaving? That's what this is about." She nodded, her lips trembling slightly as she spoke the words she knew would destroy him. "I'm not leaving tonight, but I've already made plans. I'm going to move out. I've already talked to Mike. I've decided to be with him. I know it's selfish, and I know I've hurt you, but this is what I need. I'm sorry, John. I really am." John's entire body seemed to freeze. The air between them became suffocating, and the room seemed to close in around him. His chest tightened with a mixture of anger and sadness, a flood of emotions he couldn't begin to process. "You," John's voice cracked. "You've been planning this all along, haven't you? All these weeks of pretending, and this was always the end game." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. The guilt gnawed at her, but she couldn't deny the truth anymore. She had already chosen her path, and there was no turning back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The silence that followed was the loudest thing John had ever heard. He didn't know how to process what was happening. His wife was leaving him, choosing someone else, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The finality of her words hung in the air like a cold, bitter wind. The betrayal was no longer just about an affair. It was about a woman who had been planning her escape for months, even before the confrontation in their home. And now, everything that had once felt solid, everything he had believed in, was crumbling before his eyes. John sat in stunned silence, the weight of Sarah's confession settling around him like a leaden blanket. His mind raced, his emotions a turbulent storm that refused to calm. The world around him felt distant, blurry, as though the betrayal had warped the perception of everything. He had suspected something was wrong, but this was beyond what he could have ever imagined. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "I've already made plans. I'm going to move out. I've already talked to Mike." Every syllable felt like a dagger to his heart. The foundation of their marriage, their entire life together, was crumbling before him. But amidst the hurt, a growing sense of disbelief began to take root. How could Sarah be so sure of her decision? How could she have so easily turned her back on their family? And then, as the pieces slowly clicked into place, the horrifying truth began to emerge. Sarah had been planning this escape for far longer than John had realized. The evening passed in a blur. John barely heard the faint sound of the wind rustling outside, the fire crackling on the hearth, or Sarah's occasional attempts to speak. She seemed to be waiting for him to react, to say something, but he couldn't find the words. His mind was stuck on betrayal, on the fact that Sarah had not only been unfaithful, but had also been secretly planning to leave him for months. He hadn't just been hurt by her affair. He had been deceived on a much larger scale. After what seemed like an eternity, John finally stood up, his movement stiff and mechanical. He needed air, he needed space, and above all, he needed to think. He walked out onto the cabin's porch, the cool night air biting against his skin. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the landscape. But even the serenity of nature couldn't calm the storm raging inside him. His thoughts were a chaotic mess of betrayal, hurt, and confusion. It wasn't long before Sarah joined him outside. She stood a few feet away, her body trembling slightly as the cold air hit her, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the realization that her marriage, her entire life, was about to be ripped apart by her own choices. John, Sarah's voice was tentative, breaking through the silence that had settled between them. I don't want this to end like this. I want us to be able to talk. I want you to understand why I'm doing this. John turned to face her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and anger. Understand why, he repeated, his voice raw. You want me to understand why you're leaving me? Why you've been lying to me for months? Why you're choosing Mike over our family? You really think I'm going to just sit here and accept that? Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but they weren't tears of remorse. No, they were the tears of someone who had already made their decision, someone who knew there was no going back. John, I never wanted to end like this. I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't keep pretending. I don't love you the way I used to, and I need to be with someone who makes me feel alive again, someone who sees me for who I am. Her words, though spoken with an air of finality, barely registered with John. The gravity of the situation had not yet fully settled in his mind. He had been so consumed by the emotional wreckage of Sarah's betrayal that he hadn't even thought about the practicalities. The divorce, the custody battle, the life they had built together, now being torn apart by her choices. But the consequences of Sarah's actions were about to become even more apparent. What neither of them had anticipated was a chain of events that would follow that night. Events that would spiral out of control in a way no one could have foreseen. As they stood there, the tension between them thick and suffocating, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke through the night. A car had pulled up outside the cabin. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound, and John's heart skipped a beat as he recognized a familiar silhouette in the headlights. Mike. Before he could react, Mike was out of the car and heading toward them, a smug look on his face. He had the audacity to smile as he walked up the porch, seemingly unfazed by the raw tension in the air. It was then that John realized the final act of betrayal was unfolding right before his eyes. Mike, John spat, his voice trembling with fury. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here. What the hell are you doing? Mike didn't flinch. He simply shrugged, a cocky grin never leaving his face. I came to pick up Sarah. It's time for her to leave. She's made her choice. Sarah looked at John, her face pale, her lips trembling. I thought I could do this quietly, but I guess it's time to face the music. I'm done, John. I'm leaving with Mike. There's nothing left to say. John's world tilted as he heard the finality in her words. The pain, the betrayal, hit him harder than anything he had felt before. But before he could react, before he could even process the full extent of the situation, the door to the cabin suddenly burst open, and 2 police officers emerged. The officers, who had apparently been called by an anonymous tip, moved swiftly toward the trio. The situation had taken a turn no one expected. Sarah, her face a mask of confusion and fear, looked between the officers and John, who was now standing there, too stunned to speak. One of the officers spoke, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, we have a warrant for your arrest. You're being taken into custody for attempting to flee the state with child involved in a custody dispute. The shock that John felt earlier paled in comparison to the shock now gripping him. He hadn't been expecting this. The police had been called by someone who had tipped them off about Sarah's plans to leave with Emily, their daughter. It seemed Sarah had been so focused on her own escape that she hadn't even considered the legal ramifications of taking their daughter out of state, without permission. No, Sarah gasped, her voice barely a whisper. What? I'm not. I'm not taking her. I didn't, but it was too late. The officers moved quickly, placing her in handcuffs before she could protest further. Mike stood frozen, the smug expression wiped from his face as he watched Sarah's arrest unfold before him. John stood motionless, his body numb with shock. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. In a cruel twist of fate, the betrayal that had shattered his family had now led to the involvement of law enforcement. Sarah wasn't just facing the collapse of her marriage. She was facing the consequences of her actions in a way she never could have anticipated. As Sarah was led away, her eyes met John's one last time. There was no apology, no remorse in her gaze, just a sense of resignation. It was over. For John, the events of that night would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by betrayal, legal battles, and the uncertain future of his family. But for now, all he could do was stand there, watching as Sarah's life, their life, unravel in the most unexpected of ways. In the weeks following Sarah's arrest, life for John became an unrecognizable blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and the crushing weight of public judgment. What had once been a simple family unit was now a battleground, with every decision and every step scrutinized by a court system that would determine the future of his daughter and, by extension, his own life. The betrayal, the shock of Sarah's actions, and the public exposure of the family's dysfunction had turned everything he knew upside down. And now, as the dust began to settle, the reality of the fallout from Sarah's choices settled in. The divorce, inevitable from the moment Sarah had walked away with Mike, began in earnest. John had never imagined himself as the kind of person who would go through something like this. He had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, the vows they had exchanged, the promises made with all the hope and optimism of youth. But now, those vows fell hollow, like distant echoes from a time when love had been genuine and trust had been unquestioned. As soon as the divorce papers were filed, Sarah's lawyer moved quickly, presenting the typical legal arguments, that she was entitled to half of everything, that the marriage had irreparably broken down, and that she should be granted primary custody of Emily. The entire legal process felt like a cruel farce. It wasn't just the emotional toll it took, but the sheer logistics of disentangling their lives. Split accounts, divided assets, and endless discussions about what would happen to their home, their future, and their daughter. Sarah had already made it clear that she wanted to move on, and that meant severing ties with John, both financially and emotionally. Yet, the heartache of her betrayal was compounded by the relentless legal battle that awaited them. The once shared memories of family vacations, birthday parties, and anniversaries now became painful reminders of a life that had been shattered. John's lawyer, an experienced and no-nonsense woman named Claire, advised him to focus on one thing above all else: Emily. The fight was no longer about Sarah or the marriage they had once shared. It was about making sure that Emily's well-being came first, that she would not be caught in the crossfire of their bitter dispute. The discovery that Sarah had planned to take Emily out of state without John's consent had complicated matters further. Sarah's attempt to leave the state with her daughter had become a central issue in the divorce, with the court seeing it as an act of desperation, further deepening John's resolve to fight for custody. The custody battle became the focus of the divorce proceedings. What was once a quiet matter of raising their child together had now spiraled into a contentious court case. John's primary concern was Emily's well-being. While he didn't want to deprive Sarah of her relationship with their daughter, he couldn't ignore the fact that Sarah's actions, her affair, her decision to leave him, and her attempt to take Emily without his permission had destabilized the family dynamic in a way that made him question her fitness as a mother. Emily, at only 6 years old, was caught in the middle of it all. She could sense the tension and confusion, and John could see it in her eyes every time she asked questions about why Mommy and Daddy were no longer living together. She asked, "Why can't we all go on vacation together again?" Or, "When can we visit Mommy?" The weight of Emily's questions was unbearable at times, but John knew that he had to be strong for her sake. The court proceedings were grueling. There were numerous interviews, depositions, and background checks. Social workers were brought in to assess both parents, and even Emily was interviewed, though John knew she couldn't fully understand the implications of the process. Sarah's lawyers argued for her to have primary custody, citing her bond with Emily and her role as the primary caregiver in the past. They painted John as a victim of circumstance, an angry husband lashing out in his pain. John, on the other hand, presented evidence of Sarah's actions, her affair, her arrest, and her attempt to leave the state with Emily, and how these actions had disrupted their daughter's life. His team made it clear that John was a loving, attentive father who wanted to ensure Emily's stability and security. They argued that her well-being depended on being with a parent who could provide the emotional support and structure she needed during this tumultuous time. The legal battle dragged on for months. There were court appearances, custody evaluations, and intense mediation sessions. John couldn't help but feel the pressure bearing down on him, not just as a man in the midst of a divorce, but as a father determined to protect his daughter. The pain of the divorce was bad enough, but the thought of losing Emily, his one constant, his reason to fight, was the one thing that kept him going. As if the divorce and custody battle weren't difficult enough, the entire situation had become public. John and Sarah's lives were laid bare for the world to see, the press seizing every opportunity to spin their story. The affair, the arrest, the scandal. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone seemed to want to weigh in. The whispers in the supermarket, the hushed conversations in the office, and the online comments flooded John's social media feeds. His family was now a subject of gossip, and that sting was even worse than the legal battles. Sarah, ever the social media savvy individual, had carefully curated her image online. She portrayed herself as a victim of an abusive marriage, her posts filled with inspirational quotes and self-empowerment messages. John's posts, by contrast, were few and far between, as he struggled to navigate the complicated emotions of the public eye while dealing with the very real fallout in his personal life. Despite his best efforts to keep a low profile, his image was tarnished by the media's portrayal of the situation. Rumors swirled about Sarah and Mike, fueling speculation about their relationship and their future together. Some people sympathized with Sarah, calling her brave for making a difficult choice to leave an unfulfilling marriage. Others took John's side, condemning Sarah's affair and her attempt to steal his daughter away. The noise from the public only added to John's emotional exhaustion. He wasn't just fighting for custody. He was fighting for his dignity and his reputation, all while trying to shield Emily from the chaos around them. At one point, John overheard a conversation in the grocery store. Two women were discussing the story, one of them saying, "She should have stayed with him. You don't just throw away a family like that." The other woman countered, "She deserves to be happy, too. If she wasn't happy, why should she stay?" The debate was endless, the judgment constant, and it only compounded the already unbearable situation. The divorce wasn't finalized overnight. It took months of negotiations, painful decisions, and hard-fought battles. In the end, John was awarded joint custody, with Emily primarily living with him. He felt a strange sense of relief mixed with guilt, knowing that the trauma of the divorce would affect his daughter for years to come. Sarah was granted visitation rights, though her role in Emily's life would never be the same. But even with custody settled, the damage was done. The scars of betrayal, public scrutiny, and the legal battles will remain with him, woven into the fabric of his new reality. John had won the battle for his daughter, but he knew that the journey ahead would be long and painful. The echoes of Sarah's betrayal would linger, and the lessons learned in the aftermath of the fallout would shape him in ways he couldn't yet understand. For now, though, the most important thing was Emily. He would protect her, love her, and be the father she needed him to be, no matter the pain that would follow. As the dust began to settle from the whirlwind of betrayal, divorce, and legal battles, John found himself standing at a crossroads, staring down the difficult path ahead. The pain of Sarah's affair and their broken marriage had left deep emotional scars, but time, though still raw, had begun to offer him clarity. He had learned painful lessons in the hardest way possible, but those lessons, though born of loss, were ones that would shape his future, his perspective on relationships, and the man he would become. Perhaps the most profound lesson John learned was the importance of knowing his own worth. For so long, he had defined himself by his role as a husband and father, but when that role was stripped away by Sarah's betrayal, he had been left questioning his value. In the early days of the divorce, he had felt diminished, as if his entire identity had been consumed by the unraveling of his marriage. But in the aftermath, John realized that he was more than just a husband or a father. He was a man with his own desires, dreams, and, most importantly, a future beyond the broken promises of the past. Rebuilding his life meant rebuilding himself, recognizing that he deserved respect, happiness, and a life that wasn't defined by someone else's choices. The second lesson came in the form of a painful truth. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Sarah had shattered his trust in the most brutal way imaginable. Her affair, the lies, the secrecy, and the ultimate betrayal had shown John just how fragile trust could be. It was a lesson that extended far beyond his relationship with Sarah. He learned that trust must be earned, respected, and protected, and once it's violated, it leaves an indelible mark on not only the relationship but the individual as well. For John, it meant that rebuilding trust with others, whether with family, friends, or even a future partner, would take time, effort, and vulnerability. But the betrayal also taught him the importance of trusting himself, of listening to his instincts, and of knowing when to walk away from situations that didn't feel right. As time passed, John also learned that forgiveness, though often difficult, was crucial to his healing. Forgiving Sarah didn't mean condoning what she had done or erasing the pain of her betrayal. Rather, it meant releasing the power her actions had over him. It meant letting go of the anger, the hurt, and the resentment that had once consumed him. Forgiveness was a gift John gave to himself, not for Sarah's sake, but for his own peace of mind. Forgiveness was also something he had to extend toward himself. In the early days, John had questioned his role in the breakdown of the marriage, blaming himself for not noticing the signs sooner, for not being enough. But as time went on, he learned that no matter how hard he tried, he could not control another person's choices. He had given his all to the relationship, and that was something he could be proud of. In the end, the most important lesson John took from this painful chapter was the value of family. His daughter, Emily, had been at the center of his every decision. Through the heartbreak, the chaos, and the bitterness, his focus had always been on her well-being. The divorce may have severed ties with Sarah, but it also brought John closer to the core of what truly mattered: being a present and loving father. No matter what had happened in the past, Emily was his responsibility, his joy, and his reason for carrying on. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, John knew that his priority was to provide Emily with a stable, nurturing environment. He would protect her from the scars of the past as much as possible and ensure that her future was filled with love, security, and hope. As John sat back and reflected on the past months, he realized that despite everything, despite the pain, the disappointment, and the shattered trust, he was stronger for having gone through it. He had learned what mattered most in life: self-respect, the fragility of trust, the power of forgiveness, and the unwavering bond of family. And while he couldn't change the past, he could choose to move forward with clarity, knowing that he was no longer defined by Sarah's choices or the life they had once shared. The road ahead was still challenging, but John was no longer walking alone. His own resilience, his relationship with Emily, and the lessons he had learned along the way would guide him as he began to rebuild this time, with a deeper understanding of who he was and what truly mattered. As John stood in his living room, watching Emily draw pictures at the kitchen table, he realized that the worst was behind him. The tumult of the past months, Sarah's affair, the divorce, the custody battle, the public scrutiny, had taken their toll, but it also marked the end of a chapter in his life. A chapter filled with pain, deception, and loss, but also one that taught him invaluable lessons about resilience, forgiveness, and what it truly meant to be a father. The divorce was final. The custody battle was over. Emily was safe and happy, and their bond was stronger than ever. Though there would always be scars, emotional, legal, and financial, the road ahead was now a path of his own choosing. It was a future he could shape, a future free from the shadows of Sarah's betrayal. John had learned that life doesn't always go according to plan. People change, relationships break, and even the strongest bonds can unravel. But that doesn't mean the story is over. In fact, for John, it was just beginning. The pain of the past would never fully fade. The memory of Sarah's betrayal would always linger, a reminder of what could happen when trust is shattered. But that pain no longer defined him. He had learned to live with it, to use it as a catalyst for growth, rather than a weight that held him down. As John looked at his daughter, her bright smile lighting up the room, he knew that his life now had a new purpose. His focus wasn't on the past. It was on Emily, on the family they were building together, and on the future he would create with love and strength. The end of his marriage marked the end of one chapter, but it also signaled the beginning of a new one, a chapter where John would define his own happiness, protect his daughter, and move forward with the lessons learned from a painful yet transformative journey. And as he watched Emily laugh and run around the house, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for what lay ahead. The end of one chapter was simply the start of another, one where he would write the story, and this time he would make sure it was one of healing, strength, and love.